welcome her and enjoy, and I think you're going to really enjoy this program tonight. Thanks. Take it away, Carole.
Well, breaking with tradition, I'm not going to stand behind there because I do better sitting than I do standing these days, and I do better for seeing with a light on. So, there with the old lady. Here we go. So, with that in mind, we will start with the introduction. As Historical Society programs go, this one falls into a category that I would label historical programs light. It's like when in grade school on a Friday afternoon, with all the serious work of the week completed, the teacher would take up a book and read to us into a world of story and imagination. Because what I'm going to do is read stories. They're true stories, drawn from my days as writing as a scribbler. And such life stories serve to connect us to each other and to all people everywhere, because we all laugh, we just proved that, we all cry, we all have loved and we have suffered loss. We all know what discouragement feels like, and amazement and gratitude, and in times of confusion, we have all had to figure things out for ourselves. We've all made mistakes, and we have all felt relief when rescued from our own folly. Well, that's the summary. I'm going to begin with a Depression survival story from the 1930s. What follows then are 3 stories, all of which involve a marriage proposal, but they are very different stories. In one, the proposal never happens. One happens in the nick of time, and sadly, one could break your heart. A story called The Silence of the Grave reminds us that things are not always what they seem. The lonely troubles of childhood school days are remembered in fountain pens and thermos bottles. Downtown Ruthie Brown, she demands to speak for herself. And the final brief story, A Vacation Snapshot, should be viewed as a cautionary tale. So first, how the Depression moved us to a new place. When I was growing up, my grandparents lived next door on a farm, which is why I thought of them as farmers. My grandfather worked all day building houses with my father. He smelled like sawdust and cigar smoke, not the barnyard. And that should have been a clue to me. But children don't always think past the obvious. And what was obvious was they lived on a farm. Years went by before I learned why. My grandfather, Alfred Mitchell Sutton, was a risk taker. Growing up in Gloversville, the 12th child of an immigrant family, he learned from his father's choices, both the good ones and the bad ones. He saw how it was with life, and it left him unafraid. He left home as a teenager, making his way as his father had in the carpentry trades, and he learned to rely on himself. In 1929, with the Depression about to break over everybody's heads, self-reliance was a good trait to have in your toolbox. Building loans and mortgages were not. Nonetheless, he had one of each, as well as a wife and a family. He had built a house on Grand Boulevard in Schenectady, originally to sell, but now the family lived there. And he had just completed building a new house on Curry Road in Rotterdam. As the economy collapsed, he stood to lose both properties. But then, with a little luck and a little hustle, he was able to connect with Arthur Turnbull, who owned a 50-acre farm in Princetown. Now, Mr. Turnbull was looking to move closer to his job at GE and was willing to trade the farm for that new house on Curry Road. As to the house on Grand Boulevard, that was traded for a 2-family dwelling on McClellan Street. It had rent potential and a lesser mortgage, and my grandfather hoped to salvage some of his investment. The family moved to the farm. It was obvious before long that both deals had their downside. Renters proved as difficult to find as buyers, and the bank soon foreclosed on the McClellan Street property. As to the farm, it was life-saving, but The old house, it was neither comfortable nor happy. The old house had no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no insulation, no modern heating system, and all of that the family was used to. Friends were now at a distance, hopes for the children's higher education were lost, and a convenient lifestyle had changed for the worse. Each nursed his own particular grievance, and a collective unhappiness settled over the family. Additionally, what they knew about farming was absolutely nothing. If there was any good news, it was that the fall plowing had been taken care of by Mr. Turnbull, and the land was more or less ready for planting. The only outside employment that year was the building of a small barn up at Rennick's Corners, and the whole family worked together, grudgingly, to put seed in the ground, and the summer was spent in garden tending, harvesting, and preserving for the coming winter. Besides the vegetable gardens, they grew in greater amounts potatoes, field corn, and buckwheat. A cow and a calf came with the farm. Chickens were soon acquired, and later pigs. But there was one other bit of good news. While they were still living in the city, they had taken in a boarder, a Dutch immigrant woman in her 70s, and lucky for them, she possessed a lifetime of farming experience. It was Stella who knew what to do and how to do it, and was willing to invest with them in a farm horse, which she told them they needed. So, here they were, 2 parents, 5 children, Stella the boarder, and Uncle Ed, my grandfather's brother, who was also stranded by Depression circumstances. And this household of 9, for better or for worse, rode out the Depression on the farm. In 1937, misjudging the degree of economic recovery, my grandfather once again applied for a loan and began construction on 2 new houses on that hill overlooking Broadway just beyond the 5 Corners. Sadly, this enterprise too ended in failure. Depression circumstances continued for them for a few more years before the economy really did take hold. Then new homes were once again in demand. World War II factors in here. And only then did a measure of prosperity begin to return to the family. The children grew up and got on with their lives. Both my father and my uncle built homes for their own families on that farmland. And my grandparents lived in the old farmhouse until they died. Though reluctantly at first, they and their children had embraced country living. As a child, I don't remember anyone complaining about where we lived. It was home. It was good. And we were city folks no more. All right, then. This one is called Fancy Free. Before telling this next story, I should establish a few neighborhood connections from years gone by. The building along Route 7 that today houses the business Adirondack Combustible Technologies, that was once a popular ice cream parlor run by Frank and Marion Barricle. Frank was the oldest son in the Barricle family. Their farm was neighbors to the farm that the Suttons moved into during the Depression. The Barricle kids, Frank, Eric, Emerson, and Gurley, were about the same ages as the Sutton kids, Alf, Bob, Ned, and Jane. They were all pretty much in their teenage years, and friendships developed. Now, I learned this story about 10 years ago, though it had actually taken place a good many years before that. I have called it fancy free, having looked up that term in the dictionary and confirming that more or less what it means is this: avoiding romantic entanglements. I think it fits the story. To set the scene, my Uncle Ned Sutton was in his late 80s, and I was visiting with him and his wife at their kitchen table. I had just finished reading to them a Scribblers story written by Lorraine Duffy, in which he had been featured as the main character. It was a funny story, and he did remember the day it happened. He looked over at me. "I've got another story for you," he said, chuckling a little. "I don't think I've ever told it to anyone." "Ooh," I said, "the best kind." "It goes way back, a long time, way before we were married." He glanced over at his wife. There was a twinkle in his eyes. Well, the story came about because Marion Barricle, Frank's wife, had taken on a particular problem to which she thought Uncle Ned just might be the solution. I say taken on because it wasn't her problem. It was the problem of her friend, an Englishwoman, who had come to America for a visit, found life to be pretty good, and did not want to go back. Being an accomplished baker, she had easily gotten herself a good job in a bakery up in Mount Pleasant and had settled in here to life in the States. The problem was that her visa was about to expire and she would be forced to return. There was only one way around this regulation, and that was to marry an American. And that's when Marion thought of her good friend and neighbor and bachelor, Ned Sutton. She came to him with her plan and spelled out the positives. They were both of English background, of a compatible age. She was single and an excellent housekeeper. He was single and had a house. Ned thought Marion was either kidding or crazy until she began to spell out the details of her plan, and it was obvious she had given this some thought. Here's what you do, she said. Go to the bakery in the afternoon, she's always there. Kind of take a look around as anybody would, and if she strikes your fancy, go up to the counter and with a few pleasant words to break the ice, order 24 donuts and tell her you're picking them up for me. That way she'll think of you as a friend and be at ease in talking to you, and then you can take the next step, whatever. Well, it sounded like a crackpot idea to me, Ned said, continuing his story, and I really didn't want any part of it. So I teased, you didn't go. No, he said, I did go. I got to thinking, what harm could it do? So I located the bakery, and I went. She was there working behind the counter, and she seemed nice enough. There wasn't any problem with her. It sure smelled good in the bakery. But I had the strongest feeling this was a most peculiar way to approach the bonds of matrimony, and on a fast track, too, because her departure date was rapidly approaching. Standing there, I realized I just did not have what it takes to pull this off. So, like Marion suggested, I looked around a bit, giving time for clear thinking to take firm control. Then picking up something from the display rack, I took it up to the counter, paid her for it. She smiled at me, put it in a bag, wished me a good day. And I walked out out of the shop into the afternoon sunshine, as fancy-free as I'd walked in, encumbered by nothing more than a loaf of bread. This story and the next one, if there's anybody here that has ever heard anything about this, there might be things that you would have heard about either this story or the next one. I would sure be interested to hear from anybody that had extra information, either on that one, or not this story, the one following this. Somebody might also have information on. This story is titled An Old Story, and that is for two reasons. First of all, the events occurred long enough ago that those involved have all gone to their reward. Secondly, it is an old story because variations on its theme have been playing out through the entire course of human history. So, the story. There is an earned privilege that comes with being the pastor of a small congregation. If there is time for trust to develop, people will begin to share their remarkable stories, even the deeply painful ones. And it is a sacred honor to be the keeper of such tearful whispers. Today I have reason to speak of Edie, which of course is not her real name. Edie and Bud were a middle-aged couple when we first came to their church as the young pastor and his wife. Their two children were grown and off on their own. Bud, always well-dressed and bursting with exuberant personality, was a friend to all. And Edie, beside him, was the smiling picture of a good wife. Her Sunday suit was stylish and well-fitting. Her shoes, a recent purchase. Her hair done up at the beauty shop. There was a hint of high maintenance about Edie. The details of her dress and personality, all carefully arranged. From all appearances, they were a couple upon whom the life had smiled a long trail of rich blessings. I remember at some social gathering hearing her reminisce about her happy childhood, how after school she loved riding her bicycle through the neighborhood with her girlfriends. I could picture the young Edie proudly accessorizing her bicycle, attaching to the handlebars the white wicker basket that she spoke of. I could imagine her pedaling along, matching shorts and top, sandals unscuffed, her hair held neatly in place. As far as I knew, all the parts of Edie had always been picture perfect. The girls chose to ride by the houses of friends, and Edie especially chose to ride past the house where Bud's family lived, hoping that Bud himself would be in the yard and would return her wave, and often he was. It was an early and largely unacknowledged puppy love that was easily overshadowed when serious boyfriends came into the picture. And then, one day, all the neatness and order that had supported Edie's life collapsed because there was going to be a baby. This was a time and place where such news was unthinkable, unmanageable, and in this case, unsuitable. Somehow, Bud knew of Edie's situation, and he went to see his childhood friend. I don't know if he planned the words he would say, or whether his response was spontaneous. But caring for her as he did, he asked the right question. Edie, he said, would you marry me? Well, likewise, I do not know if there was hesitation on Edie's part or immediate relief. But order was restored in this manner. And they were together until Bud's death in his late 70s. He was a good father to the little girl and to the second child, who they welcomed into the family shortly thereafter. Now, sometime later, there was a bit of trouble in the family, in no way connected to the first, and they came to rely on my husband for counsel and advice, and it was in that dark period that the old story was told. Now, I was reminded of all of this one afternoon many years later, and I was surprised to meet Edie in the hall of the nursing home where I was visiting. She had only just recently become a resident and was doing her best to make her peace with this difficult change in her life. In a haze of initial confusion, we did joyously recognize each other, but a few sentences into the conversation made it clear to me that Edie was struggling to hold on. Her thoughts faded in and out in ways I could not follow. But she was sure of our connection, and as friends we sat together side by side talking. As one of her nurses passed by, she wanted to introduce me to her. You know who this is, she said. Names did not come to her, and facts were becoming fuzzy as she struggled with her introduction. This, she hesitated, this is the daughter of that man. Again she hesitated. That man... The name did not come. You know, that man who did so much good for us all. That's what she finally said. For all of her loss of mental acuity, what was left to her was really very sweet and very much the heart of the matter. That I was not the daughter but the wife was beside the point, did not need setting straight. It was clear that what she held on to as a sure thing was this. There are good people in the world who come to us in those tight, dark, frightening passages of life and pull us through. That's what she carried in her heart as a fact. And though, yes, it was true of my husband, oh my goodness, it was even more true of hers. And now we come to Frankie. This story also is one that somebody might know information about. I'd love to hear. At its heart, this is a true story and a love story. It is also a long-forgotten story. And the small embroideries I have placed around its edges will, I think, give offense to no one. For all of those who lived its joy and pain have gone to their rest. I will begin the telling of this story at its very end. My mother and I sat talking in the living room of her apartment in Guilderland. So I said, how's everything going? Oh, fine, she said, and then she smiled. Genevieve called. Now, I have known Genevieve as I have known so many others, which is to say, not in person, but through the memories and conversations of my mother and her sister. It was a friendship that began in childhood, but it had its roots in the previous generation when Aunt Till went to New York. There, she worked as a cook in one of the fancy houses in Brooklyn. And there, she became friends with other domestics, including Julia Johnson, also of immigrant Scandinavian background. Julia began to come with Till for summer visits to my grandmother's farm. I have an old turn-of-the-century photograph showing my grandmother and her brother and other family members. Julia is in the picture, and the way her hand is resting on the shoulder of Uncle George catches my interest. What was going on there? I once asked my mother. I don't really know, she said. It was always assumed that they would marry, but they didn't. Julia married John, the chauffeur at the house where they were all employed. Since John's last name was also Johnson, nothing much changed. Miss Julia Johnson became Mrs. Julia Johnson, and life went on. Their only child was Genevieve. She was maybe a year or two older than my mother. Summer visits to the country continued, and the two girls, like their mothers, shared a deep friendship. Now, Genevieve was pretty and fun-loving, and she brought with her an aura of big city style. My mother's friends easily became her friends, and it was my mother who introduced Genevieve to Frankie, a friend from school. Both were beautiful people with an eye for a good time, and there was no stopping the spark that leaped between them. Now, Julia and John were far from pleased. Their hopes and dreams for their daughter were focused on moving ahead to a better life in the city world, and those plans did not make room for a small-town suitor, no matter how charming. They promoted their choice for her future well-being in the person of Charlie Bennett, born and bred to the big city, and they spoke strongly on his behalf. Well, Frankie left home, joined the Army, and whenever he was on furlough, came to the city to see Genevieve. And then one day, as you can imagine, he offered to her all that he had, which was himself. I do not know what pressure may or may not have been brought to bear, but I do know that when Genevieve refused his offer, there was a weight of sadness not easily borne by either of them. They did not see each other again. And just as my mother had been privy to the excitement of the romance, she was also confidant throughout the anguish of its demise. Genevieve did marry Charlie Bennett. They raised a family. And though he provided for them a comfortable life, there were problems more than what Julia and John would have been able to foresee. I cannot say if it was a happy or unhappy marriage. I can say it lasted a lifetime. My mother and Genevieve remained friends throughout the years, though because of their situations, mostly from a distance. Their last conversation in life was the one I spoke of. They were both in their middle 80s. Genevieve was living in Florida with her daughter. My mother's eyes got dreamy as she reported that conversation. Do you know what she said? She asked me. No, I said, but I'm waiting. Well, we were about ready to say goodbye, and then she said, you know, Doris, it wouldn't be us talking if we didn't talk some about Frankie. Well, more than 60 years of living had passed since that night when on the steps outside her father's house she said those words that went against her heart. 60 years, and still that tender place where love had been. Some love stories are like that. Now, some who hear this story say, oh, she should have gone with her heart. Others say, no. Of course, nothing can be proven. Uncertainties prevail. We live and love and choose as best we can. If anybody has information, as I say, I'd like to know it. The next one is the silence of the grave. The family I married into took an interest in their family history. So early on, I had heard about Great-Grandpa deForest, who fought in the Civil War and was buried at the Prospect Hill Cemetery with 2 of his 3 wives. That last part was sort of funny to 20-somethings, and it was years before I learned that there was more tragedy than humor attached to great-grandfather's family life. When my husband, who was a minister, had a burial service at Prospect Hill, we usually stopped around for a visit to Great-Grandpa's grave, so I knew the hillside location of the gray, squarish stone marker. The dates for Jacob, 1820 to 1904, were listed, and a notation that he had served his country in the infantry of the New York State Volunteer Militia. The name of Harriet Brooks, his second wife, is listed under his. They were married less than 10 years. They had 4 children, and when she died, her oldest, a boy, was not quite 9, and the baby was 18 months. Some years later, Jacob was married a 3rd time to Miss Julia Dorff. A small marker with her name on it appears to the right of the gravestone for Jacob and Harriet. Now to the left are 2 smaller stones in the shape of Gothic arches, more rustic in appearance and much older than the others. The stones are similar in size but not identical. Into one of the stones is carved 2 names: Henry T., age 3 and 29 days, and then Marcellus, age 1 and 11 days. They are the children of Jacob and his first wife, Elmira Teller. Both children died in 1851. The second stone lists the twins, born the following May. They were named for their parents, Jacob and Elmira, and they died in the summer of the year they were born, 1852. Their mother, Elmira, Jacob's first wife, lived 6 more years, but there were no more babies. Of their 8 children, 3 daughters survived to adulthood. They were children during those terrible years of family loss and young teens when their mother died at the age of 42. Some of the carvings on these stones are no longer clear, and it takes a careful study to sort out the information. What appears to be true is that Colonel deForest is buried there with his second wife, Harriet, and his third wife, Julia. But that is only what appears to be true. It is not the truth. The true story, passed only by word of mouth from one generation to the next, is this. Sheltered there in the silence of the grave is also Elmira, the first wife, the sad mother of the 4 lost babies. No marker for her was placed, and it is logical to suppose that her information was to be recorded with her husband on a suitable gravestone later for both of them. But life moved on, and within a year of Elmira's death, there was the new wife, Harriet, supervising the household, mothering the daughters of the first family. Then, almost immediately, came the terrible pressures of war, and Jacob's role as husband and father was eclipsed by that of leader of men. Anxieties, separations, serious battlefield injuries, a long recovery, the 4 babies, and ultimately, at age 45 years of age, the second young mother, Harriet, was also dying too soon, and her young family also left grieving. As for Julia Dorff, the third wife, she and Jacob had no children together, and being somewhat younger, she outlived her husband by 20 years. She remained a widow, moved back to the Philadelphia area, and collected her veteran's pension check until her death in 1924. And though her stone had been placed at Prospect Hill, she did not return there to be buried. So it appears that wife 2 and 3 are buried there. No, it's wives 1 and 2. Oh dear. This one is called Fountain Pens and Thermos Bottles. My son Jonathan, for whom such things come easy, says that a useful rule for life is this: know your equipment. And it works for him. He seems to know what to do should a thing begin to flicker, pop, bulge, buckle, or backfire. With me, it's different. I never really understood how anything works. So even the simplest equipment leaves me mystified. My earliest memories of school days remind me that zippers jam, boot buckles bend, mechanical pencils refuse their refills, and combination locks are impossible. My struggle with fountain pens and thermos bottles was a daily undoing. Now, as a bus child, I had to carry my lunch to school, and my mother bought me a lunchbox, long before the days of soft pink plastic boxes with Barbie doll motifs. Mine was a tough little no-nonsense model made of metal, gray and green. It came with a thermos bottle, which in principle was a good idea. But no matter how carefully my mother placed the stopper or how often my father took it apart and said there's nothing wrong with it, by lunchtime, traces of milk would have seeped through the wax paper, dampening cookies and sandwiches and coating the fruit. All the bus children eat their lunches together in one classroom. And there was, of course, no sink or running water for cleaning up. A teacher was assigned to preside over the group. She was already unhappy about giving up her own lunch hour and not inclined even to tolerate our noisiness, let alone our problems, especially if they occurred with frequency. So my troubles with the thermos bottle were mine alone and did not attract attention or assistance from the larger world. If only someone would invent the paper milk carton. My troubles with the fountain pen were worse and more evident as, unlike spilled milk, the stains are black. Every school child had to learn to use a fountain pen. In the latest technology of that day, such pens contained a soft plastic capsule, which filled when the pen tip was immersed in ink and the lever on the outside of the pen was maneuvered. There seemed to be so many ways this simple process could go wrong. The ink bottle itself could spill or leak or slide down the slanted surface of the desk or tip over amongst the books and papers inside. Ink on the pen tip could drop off in pools or smudges on the paper, on one's hands, on one's clothes. It could also leak from the body of the pen when unimaginable things went wrong inside. All in all, it was a messy process for a child who had trouble staying neat to begin with. The ballpoint pen offered a mighty salvation. For whatever reasons, teachers resisted its classroom use for quite some time. I don't know why, but I was a true believer from the start. By the way, afterwards, there's a few pictures. Frankie and Genevieve are over there. The deForest stone and that kind of pen is there as well. All right, downtown Ruthie Brown. What I first saw of Ruth was her head bobbing above the back of a wheelchair as with determined effort she paddled her way down the long hall to the nursing home where I had come to visit my aunt. As I passed the wheelchair, I turned to smile, taking note of her stylish jewelry, her plaid sneakers, and the bewilderment in her eyes. "When will Joanne be here?" she asked me. She seemed not to notice that I was someone she had never seen before. The activities girl was also passing by in the hall, and she said, not without kindness, "Now, Ruth, you know Joanne will be here right after work." "Oh, somebody new?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she said. "Meet downtown Ruthie Brown." Ruth Brown looked up at me then, and with some curiosity. Her eager pixie face was framed with curly salt and pepper hairdo. "You must be up from the city," I said. "Oh, yes, it was Brooklyn." Her heavy downstate accent backed up her words. I would soon learn that it was not just her accent that set her apart in this small rural community. Ruth was also packing a heavy big city attitude. She was brash and in your face. Her outspoken comments were often personal and disparaging. and with a vocabulary more to be expected from a sailor than a lady, her outbursts sometimes sent shockwaves bouncing off the walls. Ruth was a tough customer. But looking into her eyes, you could see something helpless as well. She was alert and companionable and preferred to hang out by the nurse's station rather than spending long, quiet hours in her room. Now, my aunt was in a room at the very end of the hall, so most days I would see Ruth perched with the other hall sitters, and I would stop for a short chat. I soon learned that her husband had died, that Joanne was her only child, her rock, her anchor. It was Joanne who did up her nails in bright colors, bought the stylish sneakers, and decorated the room. I learned that Ruth had enjoyed collecting antiques, had attended Brooklyn College, and that her dog's name was Hurley. She was quick to see the funny side of things, and her face crinkled pleasantly when she smiled. And then one day, our family was informed that Anne's room at the end of the hall was needed for a special use, and she was being moved into a double room. Who will her roommate be? I asked my cousin when she called to tell me. Well, she answered, for better or for worse, it's Ruth Brown. Well, my aunt was a sweet, mild-mannered woman who had weathered some of life's most trying circumstances with calmness and grace. As to the question of sharing a room with Ruth, she was non-committal. Maybe it would be better, maybe not. But that's how Ruth Brown became family. And since we didn't have to give her showers or medicine or place roadblocks in front of her various determinations, we saw a softer side of Ruth. I included her in our Tuesday afternoon tea party visits. Together we listened to Frank Sinatra and Beethoven, read stories. We laughed, played guessing games, and shared our lives. Okay, ladies, I said one afternoon, if someone gave you a ticket to fly anywhere in the world, where would you go? Ruth's answer came without hesitation. I'd go to Holland. Well, actually, she said, I've already been there. I'd love to go back. She explained that she had quit college to get married, and when her husband went to the Netherlands to study, she went with him. Well, what did he study, I asked. Well, he was a doctor, she said. I bent over the bedside table and took a closer look at the wedding photo of the soon-to-be Dr. and Mrs. Brown. One afternoon, I found both Anne and Ruth sitting in the hall. I greeted Anne first and then turned to Ruth. Can you help me? She asked. Oh, I certainly hope so, I said. What's the matter? What do you need? She looked at me squarely. A peacemaker, she said. Well, I had expected to hear something about bathroom issues. Peacemaking had not crossed my mind. Oh dear, I asked. Was there trouble? Was it here? Do you want help to make things right? She nodded her head. Well, can you tell me more? I said, can you tell me who? I could sense resistance. Do you want me to name names? She said indignantly. Well, no, if you'd rather not. Was it something you said? I rightly guessed. And again, she nodded her head. I think you'll find a way to let me know, I said. We moved back down the hall, settled ourselves with our little tea table outside the door to their room. There was the usual parade of traffic in the hall. I watched Ruth for a sign. Now, Tammy is one of the hall nurses. She's a tall redhead. She seems to be good at what she does. I see her take time for pleasantries with the residents, but she brooks no nonsense when it comes to getting the job done. She stopped to exchange a few words. We laughed. And then she said, I'm not talking to Ruth anymore today. Quickly, I glanced at Ruth. She was not looking at Tammy, and she was not looking at me. I bent toward her and said in a soft voice, is this your situation? There was no word, just an almost imperceptible nod of her head. I took that as a sign. Tammy, I began, Ruth has asked me to help her with something. She knows an apology is in order, and she wants you to know that she wishes those big black words that came flying from her mouth had instead been soft little butterflies. Tammy blinked. Her surprise became a smile and then a chuckle. Well, that was colorful, she said, nodding at Ruth as she turned to go. I think your apology was accepted, I said. I was never told what the big black words actually were. But soon after that, the speech therapist began working with Ruth. "You can't cuss in this place," Ruth told me. "They want me to say," the brow furrowed as she tried to think what it was they wanted her to say. "Is it sugar?" she asked. "Oh, likely," I said. "That is likely, very likely." Well, one day we were talking about her young life in Brooklyn. "What was your family's name?" I asked. It was Ettinger. Her father had been a furrier. His shop was in Manhattan. "Did you ever get to play with the furs?" I asked. "Oh, not too much," she said, "but he gave me a mink coat. It's in there." She indicated the serviceable particle board wardrobe that was standard issue for every resident. She suggested that I bring it out, and we ran our hands through the softness of the fur and admired its classic elegance. As I carefully returned it to its place, I thought to myself that Ruth Brown was probably the only one on the B-wing with a mink coat hanging in her wardrobe. Probably the only one in the nursing home. Maybe even the only one in the town. And lastly, a vacation snapshot. I've chosen to close out tonight's story time with a short and sweet cautionary tale. Short, because it didn't take long to happen, and sweet, because we all survived. For my husband and myself, it remained one of the most dramatic moments of our shared life. I have called it a vacation snapshot, but it also has a subtitle, Memoir of a Large Animal We Met Once Briefly. The story began for us on a fine June day. We had passed through the extraordinary scenery of the upper reaches of the Yellowstone Park and out through its northern gate, on our way to enjoying a honeymoon summer near the Canadian Rockies. Earlier in that day, we had been told to be alert, for we were traveling in moose country. Perhaps greenhorn tourists from the east should be told more. At any rate, we were watchful and camera-ready, scanning the green meadowlands and the edges of a stream as it meandered through a broad valley. It was late in the afternoon when we caught the glimpse of what we had been waiting for. Off to our right, a grassy wooded landscape dropped away in a gradual slope toward a swampy area. And standing knee-deep in the waters of the bog were several moose, heads lowered to feed. My husband pulled the car to the side of the road and stopped. Swinging the camera strap up over his head, he eased open the car door quietly so as not to startle them and slipped into the woods. From a safe vantage point, he brought the camera to his eye, but the view was disappointing. The distance too great, the image too uncertain. The only solution was to move closer from tree to tree, cautiously down the embankment, further from the car, and closer to that imagined National Geographic Prize-winning photo. Final adjustment for light and distance, then, eye to the camera, he stepped from behind the tree, only to drop the camera in panic and turn to run for his life. The bull moose, greatly affronted by this intrusion, was moving swiftly to deal with it. There was a great crashing about in the woods and a mad dash in the direction of the car. With my heart in my throat, I flung open the door, and quicker than you could say Saratoga, the front runner burst into the car. For a moment, the moose stood wide-eyed and snorting at the edge of the pavement and then turned back into the woods. It took us somewhat longer to regain our composure before we too moved on. Throughout the summer, we were with people who knew big game. "Oh, no," they said when we told our harrowing story. "You know, moose are not like deer. They are not afraid. They will charge." It was the trees that saved you. With their great rack of antlers, moose cannot easily maneuver in close woods. Well, you might wonder about the photo. And yes, there was a photo. Thanks to the neck strap, the camera survived intact, and whether by force of habit or rush of adrenaline, the shutter was clicked. And when the film was developed, it was all there to tell the story. the great green blur which fills the picture. That's the grassy swamp. And there, a little to the right of center, moving towards the camera, that's the moose. The end. I can't imagine that there are any questions, but if you'd like to see pictures of some of the people, they're over there.
Thank you, Carole.